Continuing our look at exploration, today we're going to look at how exploration impacted the continent of Africa. As a brief preview, I want to remind you of what came before, what we discussed in 6th grade social studies as far as African history. Remember, there were three great West African kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, and the Songhai. These three countries became incredibly wealthy due to two commodities, or two valuable items that we discussed in 6th grade, gold and salt. In fact, although it makes no sense at all to modern ears, salt actually was as valuable as gold during the time period of 6th grade social studies. The Songhai, which was the last of the three great West African kingdoms, was destroyed by the Moroccans, a northern tribe of Africans who received guns from Europe. And that's approximately where we're going to pick up with Africa during this time period. The main reason Europeans came to Africa during this time period was because Europeans had become highly interested in the concept of slavery. Now, as we discussed on Monday, when Europeans first showed up in America, they got slaves from the Native Americans and took them back to Spain. Once they realized that they were going to be doing a lot of business in the Americas, though, and they might need slaves, they decided that Africa was a fertile breeding ground for the slave trade. Now, at the beginning of the school year, I told you that sometimes we teachers kind of like to focus on just the easier aspects of history instead of telling you the grim and gritty details. Well, the slave trade is one of those topics that sometimes teachers just kind of gloss over. The Europeans wanted slaves for their businesses, but they couldn't go get the slaves because they weren't soldiers. So to help them get slaves, what they did was they would actually team up with African tribes, and the African tribes would go and fight other tribes that they thought they could beat up. Tribes that lost would then be sold by their fellow Africans as slaves. So although sometimes we think that it was all the Europeans that were doing the slave trade, and although sometimes we think that the Europeans are solely to blame for the slave trade, please realize that actually both sides were completely responsible. The slave trade was an attempt to create a fertile breeding ground of trade, much like Europe already had with Asia. As the two sides got together, they just tried to decide what each side would benefit the most from. Europeans just wanted slaves, and so Europeans traded for slaves. Meanwhile, African tribes had a variety of interests. They wanted weapons so they could fight better. They wanted horses, and they wanted gold. Everybody wanted gold. At the beginning of the year, I wanted us to review the concept of economics. One of the key rules of economics is that as demand for an item increases, that businesses will then try to increase the supply to meet the demand. This is considered Economics 101. Well, as the demand for slaves in America increased, tribal warfare in Africa increased also. Demand leads to an increase in supply. African tribes thought, why in the world should they just sit there nicely when they could be going out and making lots of money off selling people they really didn't like in the first place? Growing up, one of my all-time favorite actors was Charlie Sheen. As anybody that's paid any attention to his life lately, though, knows, one thing he really likes to talk about right now is winning. And one of the simple facts of life is that winning is valuable. And so the winning tribes became very wealthy, selling their enemy tribes down the street. Losing tribes, unfortunately, became very weak or became slaves automatically. And this is going to create a big problem for Africa as time goes on. The sad results of this process, not the least of which is the fact that many Africans were sold into slavery, is the ultimate effect it's had on Africa as a whole. When it lost so much of its workforce to intertribal warfare and then being sold into slavery, Africa as a continent became a very poor place to live. Few groups were left completely intact. Entire families were broken up, entire tribes were broken up, and Africa became the lost continent in a lot of ways. In conclusion, much like in Asia, there was really little colonization of Africa during this time period. Colonies were mainly going to be formed in the Americas, which we'll start talking about tomorrow. Instead, Africa served as little more than a resource to the rest of the world, and the main thing it was being a resource for wasn't the gold that it had or the salt that it had, but it was the people. This is a sad state of affairs that we'll talk about more this year.